Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai. Welcome to tonight's webinar. This is the on the sports and recreation complaints and mediation service. How it can benefit you and your organisation now and into the future. So ko Josh Margetts toko ingoa. I'll be your host for this evening, and I will just start by letting everyone know that this webinar will be recorded and supplied at a later date. But before we get into tonight's session and to the housekeeping, I would like to start with karakia. Tutawa is a beautiful karakia that helps us settle into tonight's shared kaupapa or purpose. It's a great way to create a safe space where we can engage, connect and learn for the allotted time before being released back into our day-to-day lives. So if you have this on the screen, feel free to join. Tutawa mai I runga, tutawa mai I raro, tutawa mai I roto, tutawa mai I waho, kia tauai te mauri tū, kia tauai te mauri ora, tū to the whakamaua kia tina, tina, homie, huie, tai kie. Excellent. So I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. Welcome to everyone that's dialing in. I'm really excited for tonight's session, and I'm sure you're going to get so much from our guest speaker, Henry Moore. So this webinar is part of a wider activity around increasing awareness relating to integrity, and it's an important part of sport and recreation, as well as sharing some guidance that may be relevant to you and what support is available for everyone. So we all have a role to play in this, whether it's as a volunteer, activity leaders, coaches, parents, administrators at a national or regional level, or participants and athletes. And I see a great range of experiences from the participants in the chat today. So before I introduce Henry and get into the conversation, there are a couple of housekeeping things that are great to mention. So we will be running a couple of polls in the chat function tonight, so please look out for these. We'll queue them in. They should pop up in the chat box, so it'd be great to see everyone taking part in those. If you do have any questions, thoughts or stories that could relate to what we are presenting on tonight, please pop these into the chat. The more engagement, the better. And hopefully either a Sport NZ colleague of mine will be monitoring these in the chat throughout, and do our best to answer those either in the chat function, or we've got some allotted time at the end that we'll be able to pick up on any questions that Henry and I may not have covered throughout. And if we're not able to answer all of the questions, we'll make sure to address those in any summary notes that we provide. So if you haven't already, prop your name and your organisation or activity into the chat window. And if you're having any technical issues with the video or chat, close the window and just rejoin through the MS Teams web link instead of the Teams app. It is also important to note that complaints, issues, concerns, and dispute resolution can be a really complex and sensitive topic at times. We may not be able to cover everything there is to know about this topic, especially in such a short time. So it's important to note that this isn't the forum for discussing or raising specific situations that may be sensitive in nature or require privacy considerations. So this conversation really does require respect, empathy, and understanding in order for it to be a valuable and safe experience for everyone tonight and moving forward. So let's get into tonight's conversation. How the SRCMS can benefit you or your organisation now and into the future. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce our guest this evening, Henry Moore. Henry's an experienced sports lawyer with over 10 years of legal experience in New Zealand. He's been responsible for fronting highly sensitive athlete disputes, negotiating collective agreements, resolving integrity-related matters, launching integrity-specific education, and implementing crisis management plans. He's assisted many parties with resolution of their sports disputes through his role as Manager of Legal Innovation at Mediation. So Henry's got so much knowledge and experience in this area, and I've been so lucky to be able to connect with Henry on multiple occasions over the years, and I know you're going to get so much of value out of the information from him tonight. So Henry, welcome. After that intro, I'll hand over to you and leave it to you to introduce yourself, share a little bit about yourself and your work, and then feel free to just jump straight into the content for this evening.
Kia ora, Josh, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks for the very kind introduction, Josh. Yeah, so by way of background, I've been helping deliver the SRCMS since it was established in February 2021. I've worked across law and sport for, as Josh mentioned, a decade. And I must admit, when I started in this role, I had no idea the types of issues and disputes that existed in sport across the country. I primarily worked in professional sport, and that only touched the surface. So I must say that sitting in my seat, I've seen the real benefit of an independent complaints mechanism. Whether my company or our company is delivering it or not, the fact that it's here and benefiting the community is the most important point. So that leads me in to, I suppose, why the SRCMS was established. And I'll just provide a bit of background here so that you'll understand why the SRCMS was set up in the first place. So back in 2019, Sport New Zealand undertook an integrity review. And that was a public consultation process designed basically to look at all the integrity arrangements in New Zealand. So in effect, what was working really well, what wasn't in place, or what potentially could be improved. And so a number of organisations and individuals were spoken to as part of that process. And it included areas like member protection, issues in children's sport, organisational culture, which is a big theme that I'll talk to later, whistleblowing, again, SRCMS provides that service, and then doping, corruption, and match fixing. So basically any integrity related issue that you'd see across sport around the world, this integrity review covered off. That was a pretty thorough process, and out of that process came 22 recommendations. And there were two principal recommendations that Sport New Zealand decided that it could set up pretty quickly and could have the biggest impact across the sport and active recreation sector. One of those was a central online repository for integrity resources that Sport New Zealand has set up, and Josh will talk to at the back end of this presentation. The other was establishing an independent complaints service. And Sport New Zealand set that up almost immediately in 2019. Our company then wasn't delivering that service. It was limited in scope to just high performance sports related issues. But what Sport New Zealand then did a couple of years later was undertake a feasibility report into that complaint service and see whether it was still fit for purpose. And again, on the back of the work the Sport Integrity team did, they realized that there was a need to expand the service to not just cover high performance related issues, so the ones that you'd see typically on the front page of the paper, but also extend the scope of the service to all community sport and active recreation. And that was really important because it needed to be a service that was accessible by absolutely everyone. And I must say, and again, I'll talk to it later, the presence we've had in the community space has been huge, and again, shows the need for it to be across the sector altogether. Talking to a few bullet points there, it was important that the complaints service was independent. And what I mean by independent is independent of Sport New Zealand and all of sport. So as Josh touched on, I work for a company called a Mediation, which is a complaints mediation managed service organization that provides end-to-end dispute resolution services, just like we do in this space. We have no affiliation or association with any sport organization at all. Yes, our funding comes from Sport New Zealand. The service needed to be funded, and Sport New Zealand does fund the service, but we are entirely independent of everyone. And that's a really key point, because some people, and we've experienced this, some people just don't have the confidence to go directly to their sport or their manager or their employer or even Sport New Zealand to discuss these concerns for fear of retribution, retaliation, non-selection, for example. So it's really important that there is an independent service that complements already existing sports complaints processes that people can access to try and resolve disputes independently. The next point is another key one, in that the service needs to be free, and it is free. Reason being is that Sport New Zealand, when designing the service, wanted to make sure that cost wasn't a barrier. So anyone that contacts the service and speaks to me or any of our triage team doesn't have to pay for that service, and that's really important. It needs to be accessible to all, as I say. Voluntary. So what I mean by that is the service is voluntary. So we can't compel participants or organisations to participate in our processes. We are a consent-based process, which means that because it is alternative dispute resolution, we need to make sure that when we are providing opportunities for people to resolve disputes, that they're willingly participating. The next one, confidentiality. So again, this is probably, if you take one point away from tonight, please take this one away, which is the service is confidential. It's really important that people understand that when they contact the service and they talk to me or a colleague, that conversation is in strict confidence. We don't share that conversation or any aspects of that conversation with anyone at all without the consent of the person that we're talking to. Obviously, if we're worried about someone's health and well-being and there's some legal reasons as to why we might need to talk to other agencies or providers, that would be the only reason where we might need to breach that confidence. But please appreciate that anything that you discuss with us is entirely confidential. I've already covered off the fact that it's a community to elite level service, so I won't go into that again. And the last point, they're complementary to existing mechanisms. So what I mean by that is our service isn't designed to replace sports policies. So for example, I look at those people attending this webinar. So Croquet New Zealand, for example, you might have your own complaints process. We aren't designed, our service hasn't been designed to replace your complaints process. We're there to complement it. If we can help by providing any of the services that we'll talk to later that will complement what you already have, then great. But please know that we're just another option for people to raise concerns if they want to.
That's an excellent summary, Henry. Thank you for that. And we do have a poll coming through now in the chat function, just as an interesting point here. So it reads, how many queries do you think have come through the service, SRCMS, in the last 2 years? 0 to 50, 50 to 100, 100 to 200, or 200 plus? If you want to submit that. And Henry, you'll be able to speak to this once we've got some answers coming through in terms of the volume of queries that you would have received over the last 2 years. And while that is happening, Henry, one of the points that I think you highlighted there that I think it's really important to touch on is not, I guess, initially the independent complaints service was strictly around sport and a lot of it around that high performance environments, whereas this isn't just traditional sport but also active recreation as well, right?
Yep, absolutely. The majority of our inquiries are sports related inquiries, but absolutely we're available to assist anyone in the active recreation space. And encourage anyone on this call who's involved in active recreation to spread the word as best you can. Brilliant.
So it looks like we've got the responses in there, Henry, with 6% thinking in the 0 to 50, 13% in the 50 to 100, and 40% split between both the 100 to 200 and 200 plus. So put us out of our misery, mate. What is the answer here?
So as of this week, it's 291. So yeah, on average, sort of 150 each year, which has really surprised me in terms of the demand for the service, and shows that there's absolutely a need out there.
And has that increased more over time, the more awareness that has got out about the service, or was it from day one being utilised pretty consistently?
No, you're right. The demand for the service has increased over time through awareness and through the work that Sport New Zealand's doing to promote it. And it's probably a nice segue in terms of sporting organisations. So we've assisted across 60 different sports, and typically when we've dealt with one sport, they have knowledge of the service, they have a knowledge of the types of dispute resolution options we provide. They know how we can help, and so they know that they can come back to us if they ever think that we can be of assistance. So the service in that regard sort of promotes itself.
Yeah, brilliant. It certainly sounds like there's a really broad range of queries, concerns, issues, complaints coming through. But I guess segue into the next slide around what are some of those key themes of those 290? And I do see Simon has posted a question there around a high-level active rec example, which we might be able to get to in time. But what are some of those key themes that you're seeing from the service?
So do you want to? Oh, there we go. So here are some key themes that we're seeing across the board. As I mentioned, 60 odd different sporting organisations that we've assisted, and to be honest, a high proportion of the issues that we're seeing are of high risk and involve a lot of sensitivity and vulnerable individuals, a lot higher than I probably envisaged. As well, 25% of our inquiries relate to high performance. So 75% of what we see is in the community level space. So again, an example of why it was important to expand the service to include all of sport and active recreation. And just another, I'll talk to these themes shortly, but just by way of painting the picture. So national sporting organisations are involved in around 50% of all of the matters that we've dealt with, whether as a bystander or an actual party. The fact that the national sporting organisation is involved again helps with that promotion that you talked to earlier. But in terms of the themes, these are again standard integrity themes that you'd probably see across the board in sport and recreation. 20% of our complaints relate to allegations of inappropriate behaviour by coaches, committee members, players, and parents. So that would be, by way of example, sideline behaviour, bullying behaviour, unmanageable conflict between coaches and parents and clubs and athletes. So the typical sort of inappropriate behaviour that you might see again in the news and through any involvement in the work that everyone does in the sport and rec space. In terms of allegations of conflict of interest, particularly at the committee level, an example of this might be a committee member making a decision about the employment of a coach to a representative team, and appreciating that particularly at the community level, everyone's volunteers and everyone's trying to help and everyone knows everyone. Sure. That there can be quite a few conflicts at that lower level. So the example I've just gave is one that we've seen a couple of times now, and I imagine we'll continue to see. Complaints about ethics or culture of organisations. Again, if someone has a concern about the way that their organisation is conducting itself, then again they can contact us. Going to the second column there, complaints about inadequate complaints handling. This is probably the most common theme that we see. I think around 40% of our complaints have this theme. And what I mean by that is that people, often individuals particularly, come to us who have attempted to resolve their complaint through the sport or the recreation complaints process, and don't feel like they've been adequately heard or or treated fairly or reasonably. And so they come to us to see whether or not we can assist with attempting to resolve the issue by way of a dispute resolution process. So again, as I say, that's a very, very common one. Health and safety concerns, child safeguarding, lack of club policy, those types of things. Unfairness of rules and policy. So again, that's sort of the impact that rules and procedures on people's participation. We saw a lot of that during COVID, particularly. Number of inquiries coming through during that period. And then allegations of human rights breaches, so discrimination, racism, those types of things. So yeah, as I say, typically what you'd expect to see in the sport integrity space.
Yeah, excellent. And that, I think that leads us on to the next point, a little bit more specific around the service itself, Henry. So how can people access this? What are the means that people can get in touch if there is a complaint, a query, an issue that they want to hear from you about?
Yeah, sure. So there we go. So there are two ways that people can contact us. So phone, the 0800 number there, and typically you'll get me or you'll get one of my team members. And the other way is an online form. So if you access our website, which is sportsmediationservice.org.nz, you'll find a link through to a platform we use called Whisply, which is a anonymous and whistleblowing platform that allows you to make a complaint, whether identified or non-identified. So those are the two ways that you can get your complaint through to our triage team. As I've touched on already somewhat, at the end of the day, the benefits of the service are that we're here to help. We're impartial. You know that when you're talking to us, you're talking to experts. We appreciate that a lot of the issues that you'll be raising with us are sensitive ones. So it's important that we handle those with a real sense of sensitivity and care. And we do really appreciate that it's very hard for people to have these conversations with us. Mm-hmm. I don't underestimate at all how hard it is for people to pick up the phone and contact me. They've never met me before, to talk about an issue that's clearly concerning them, that potentially they've never spoken to anyone about.
Yeah.
And so it's really important that when they are talking to us, that they know that we're trustworthy, that they know that we're not going to share that information with anyone, and ultimately they can tell their story with absolutely no obligation to take it any further. So again, if you want to remain anonymous, you can do that. You can have a conversation with us on a completely de-identified basis without having to disclose what sport it is, what your name might be, who the respondent might be, or any of the other parties, who they might be. You can merely just pick up the phone and contact us, understand what we do, and make a decision at a later date whether or not you want to take things further. So I just encourage you to get in touch, knowing that if there is something that's burning, or you know that someone needs help, encourage them to give us a call, and we'll do our best to help them.
Brilliant, Henry. And we've just had an excellent question in the chat around what kind of response time could people expect when contacting the service?
Yeah, really good question. So on the phone, you'll get someone when you ring through. If they're on a call already, they will call you back the same day. So we will always get back to you either when you call or same day. In terms of an online form, I get an automated message every time an inquiry comes through, and then we will typically respond to that online inquiry through the platform, and then set up either a phone call or an email exchange. So typically within 24 hours.
Excellent, brilliant. And I see, yeah, a round of applause from someone in the chat around that response time. So that's well received. I think that takes us on to a little bit more detail around what are the different aspects within the service that are on offer. So I'll go to the next slide and let you speak to these points.
Yeah, sure. So this is the meaty part. This is effectively what we do each and every day. So please just fire through some questions if you need me to clarify anything. But the first point there, the initial inquiry or triage. So we've talked about that, the initial inquiry when you ring us or you fill out an online form. I describe this process as sort of threading the needle. So understanding what the initial complaint is, and then deciding what best dispute resolution pathway might exist for that particular dispute. So the main purpose of this first this first point is two I suppose processes that we need to go through. First, we need to confirm whether the issue is within scope of the service. So if it's in connection with sport or active recreation, it's in scope of the service. So obviously most issues that would arise in the sporting context or the recreation context will be in scope of the service. Very rarely do we get anything outside of scope, but it is important that we triage, as I say, the inquiry to make sure that it's actually something that's that we can help with. The next is then assessing what appropriate pathways might exist. And in order to make that assessment, we need to look at, for example, the nature of the dispute, the parties involved, the history of the dispute. Particularly when the service first started, there were a number of protracted disputes that had been through other dispute resolution processes. And again, we need to explore whether or not we could add another layer to that. Obviously, what's central to all of this is what the complainant ultimately wants, because ultimately we don't want to provide a process that they're not comfortable with. And typically, because our processes are dispute resolution processes and voluntary processes, we need to make a decision as to whether or not a negotiated resolution looks realistic, i.e., are the parties actually going to be able to talk to each other and find a way forward? And so, particularly in that last point, what we need to look at is whether or not there are other external bodies or tribunals that might be better equipped to deal with the issue. So, for example, it might be more appropriate for us to suggest to the individual that they go back to their sport if they're comfortable with it, because they have a comprehensive complaints policy that we think might be able to help. And typically, if we've had a really good if we have a really good relationship with that national sporting organisation or the active organisation, the recreation organisation, that we would encourage them to go through that process. There might be other agencies like the police, particularly if something's of a criminal nature. It's important that we refer those people to the appropriate body. The Human Rights Commission, that's another one that we have a good relationship with to ensure that people, if we think it's more appropriate for a Human Rights Commission process. They typically provide similar processes to us, but what we have found is that if someone receives a letter from the Human Rights Commission, it has a bit more power than authority than a letter from the SRCMS. The Privacy Commissioner is another one that we work with, and even the Sports Tribunal. So a lot of people want us to make decisions to find out or make a determination as to whether or not someone's right or wrong. We don't do that. So typically the Sports Tribunal might be a more appropriate avenue for people if they want a decision to be made. And then, so that's the triage process. After that triage process, if we believe that we can provide a dispute resolution pathway, then we can offer parties those early facilitation, mediation, investigation services. So those points 2, 3, and 4 on the slide. I'll talk through very briefly and give a few examples as to what each of those is. So early facilitation is a very simple concept whereby it's the most flexible and informal process imaginable that we can provide, whereby one of our team works with the person that's contacted us and the other party to the dispute to attempt to resolve it without the parties needing to get around the table and mediate that issue. So typically the parties at this point aren't in a constructive dialogue. Yeah. And more often than not, the communication channels between the parties is broken down. So what we will do, our role as the SRCMS team, would be to work collaboratively with both parties to attempt to try and resolve the issue without the parties needing to get in the room and sort it out themselves. And typically, if if the respondent, for want of a better word, or the other party to a dispute isn't aware of the complainant's concerns, by us merely contacting that other party sometimes has the effect of has the impact on the respondent to take action and realize that, hey, this is something that could be very easily resolved.
Sure.
So a couple of examples would be obviously on a de-identified basis, but we had a dispute between a national sporting organisation and an athlete related to a health and safety guideline that had been introduced. And basically that health and safety guideline meant that this particular athlete could not participate in the upcoming event within 24 hours of us receiving the complaint. So what we did is we worked with the national sporting organisation and the athlete to try and facilitate a compromise to allow the athlete to play. And that was merely me having a conversation with the national sporting organisation, get them to appreciate how much of an issue it was for the athlete, what a compromise might look like for the athlete, and we were able to facilitate an outcome there. Again, without the need to have a mediation, and obviously in the interest of time to allow that athlete to participate. Another one, we received a complaint from a group of parents about a complaint that was actually in the media at the time. And the national sporting organisation didn't want to meet with the group of parents, but was happy to work with us to try and facilitate a compromise without getting around the table and mediating. So we were able to effectively bat the issues around between parties to try and identify and ultimately come to a resolution that all parties were happy with. As you'll see, this early facilitation stage is very much us working with both parties. So you can appreciate, hopefully, that this early facilitation stage doesn't always resolve the issue, and it's often a bridge to mediation. So what mediation is, as most of you will probably know, it's a facilitated process whereby an independent mediator is appointed to mediate the issue. We've got an expert panel of mediators with our service that allows us to handpick some of New Zealand's best mediators to facilitate a process, and this can be done online or in person. For those on this call that are members of organisations, national sporting organisations or active rec organisations, we do receive a number of referrals from these bodies who we've worked with in the past, who aren't necessarily a party to a dispute, but have identified that a mediation process could be useful. Please feel free to pass these matters on to us, and we can help facilitate the appointment of a mediator and get that sorted. There are numerous examples with mediation, but basically, if there's a dispute that's appropriate for a negotiated settlement, i.e. parties are willing to sit around the table and discuss the issues, we can provide it. We've got a 100% success rate at mediation. I put that down to the fact that the parties are already almost at resolution if they've agreed to get around the table. And we all know in sport and active rec that everyone knows everyone. Disputes in sport are often very personal, and so by merely just getting the parties to the table, often, in all situations, that's been a successful outcome. Investigations. This was a service that was added to the SRCMS's arsenal in October 2021. And the reason being is that if something's more appropriate for an investigation, i.e. there needs to be a finding of fact. Someone needs to determine whether something happened or didn't happen, i.e. it's not a negotiated settlement, then investigations can be the more appropriate avenue, just like a workplace investigation would be a good analogy. What we can do is if something is appropriate for investigation, then we can appoint an independent investigator from our panel of investigators to assist with this. So really it's just determining whether something happened or didn't happen. You're getting someone independent to make that assessment. One thing to flag here though, they are very costly exercises, so we do need to get Sport NZ's pre-approval before we facilitate that process. But some examples of the investigations we've assisted with, the there were serious allegations of bullying made against a coach by multiple complainants, and the club concerned approached us to see whether we could provide an investigator to determine whether or not the allegations could be substantiated. So one of our investigators came in, interviewed complainants, responded, any witnesses, and then makes a finding of fact and provides that report back to the relevant sporting organisation. Another one was allegations of racism and discrimination made against a committee member by members of the public because they saw a social media post. So we assisted with, we helped the local club establish an investigation, and one of our investigators was able to undertake a report and provide the findings back to the club. Another one, we had 2 athletes during a competition who got into, or there was an incident between the 2 of them, and the sport asked us to investigate to determine whether the actions of one of the athletes brought the sport into disrepute. So again, clearly those examples aren't appropriate for a mediated process, so we were able to help with that. And just very lastly, in terms of support, it's important that all of you appreciate that anyone that contacts the service can get free counselling support. So, and that's not just an individual who's come to us with a concern, it's anyone in connection with that dispute. So please be aware of that, and we offer that to everyone when they contact us. And obviously accessibility requirements, language requirements, we can provide translators, and obviously it's important that anyone that accesses our service is comfortable with the process being provided. So if there are cultural needs that need to be provided, then we can do that.
Yeah, brilliant. Excellent information there, Henry. And really quickly, in the essence of time, I've got a few questions, but if you could briefly touch on, like, what advice would you give to any individual who's apprehensive about reaching out or not sure if this service is the right channel for them?
Yeah, really good question. I would encourage them to give us a call, and appreciating that they can remain anonymous throughout the whole process. And if at any time they feel comfortable taking things further, then we'll remain available. Yeah. But please, if there is something pressing, then get in touch with us, because we do receive a number of inquiries like that where people do want to remain anonymous because of the sensitivity of the issue they're dealing with. But equally, they might not appreciate how confidential our process is or how independent it is. And so by merely just talking to us, they get a sense of how we might better help, but equally whether it's appropriate for them.
Excellent, excellent. I love that detail around the value for individuals and seeking support for this, but I'm also keen to understand from an organisational perspective, what is the value that this service can have for them, or what should they have in place when it comes to receiving complaints and acting? And I see we've got a really great question from Lewis in the chat around, and he's asked, given privacy and confidentiality, what ability does the service have to share learnings, best practice, etc., to help organisations learn from or avoid issues from others? Which I really think speaks to that capability that organisations need to have around receiving complaints. So can you speak to a little bit about the organisation's responsibility, Matt?
Yeah, sure. So helpfully, Sport New Zealand has a suite of resources available, and one of those being a complaints policy template. And the reason I mention that is, from my perspective anyway, it's really important that all organisations have a complaints framework, and typically that will look like informal dispute resolution, like we're talking about here, but also disciplinary processes. But making sure that individuals within their membership, within their community, have access to a transparent and trusted complaints process. Now, that's not going to stop people coming to us as well. But what I would encourage all organisations to do is, one, have a really comprehensive complaints policy. Two, understand how we can complement it, i.e. if it ever gets to the point they need assistance with triaging a dispute, or whether they think mediation or investigation could be appropriate, that they pick up the phone and have a conversation with us as well. That happens a lot. Brilliant. Those types of general inquiries as to whether or not we can assist. But just making sure that everyone has an opportunity to raise concern. whether it be through their own frameworks or through us, and appreciating that disputes in sport or in society exist, issues exist, and we just need to make sure that people feel comfortable raising them.
Yeah, that is really great insights. Thanks, Henry. And I think it really speaks to the importance of organizations taking a participant-centered approach to not only, I guess, supporting their community, but strengthening their own processes. And I think that really creates trust and confidence from their community that any issues, concerns, complaints will be handled in an appropriate way. And like you said, you've referenced there that there is a complaints policy template that's free, downloadable, and interactive, that can be adopted and adapted by any organisations in the sector through the Sport NZ Integrity Portal. So I really encourage participants, if you haven't checked that out, to go and look at that. There's also the SRCMS Quick Guide, which is on the SRCMS website, which gives a bit of a summary of the service, what it does, what it doesn't do, and how to access it and what to expect. So this does bring us to the end of the presentation and conversation. We do have a few minutes left for any other questions that may have come into the chat. And one has just come in. Do you have any recommendations of where local clubs can get support to improve their complaints and dispute resolution procedures?
Very good question, Hannah, and it's one that often comes to us because we can't provide legal advice. We unfortunately can't assist with that. And what I typically do when I receive inquiries like that is direct people to Sport NZ's suite of policies. And I'm not just saying that because we're on a Sport New Zealand webinar at the moment. They generally are really, really useful. And so you can sort of sense check what you've already got in place against that. Equally, there will be, and there are a number of lawyers out there who would provide that sort of assistance. I know the Sports Tribunal have a legal aid a legal aid panel. There's obviously community law centres and things like that. But typically, if your complaints process or procedure is consistent with what Sport New Zealand has in place, then you'll be heading in the right direction.
That's great. And just to reiterate that point, Hannah, I guess the value that resource has, that Sport NZ has developed, is that has been drafted with legal support and guidance, and also any specialist expertise in this area. And we've made that commitment to keep it updated to any legislative changes or best practice or feedback from how it's been implemented as well. So that's a really good tool. And I also see a tip from Charlotte as well around reaching out to either your RST network or potentially an NSO as well, that may be able to provide some guidance in that space. So another great port of call there as well. I will encourage, if there are any further questions, to please reach out, and we'll do our best to answer those. But in the meantime, in the essence of time, I'd just like to thank you, Henry, so much for sharing your experience and knowledge with us tonight. I know I'm sure I can speak on behalf of everyone that they've picked up a lot of absolute gold from what you've shared. And as I said to everyone, this is just an overview of the service, but you can check out more info through the SRCMS website or by reaching out to Henry directly. We will be releasing this webinar recording and the associated notes and links. So please keep an eye out for that on our website, and we'll email that out as well if you need to rewatch any of the discussion. So to everyone on the call, thank you so much for tuning in and contributing to the conversation. I hope we've added to your kit and are now a little bit more confident in accessing the service, and have a better understanding of what it does. So before I release us, I'll let us go with karakia and bring us out of this dedicated time, release us back into our lives, and we can carry on with our evening. Tu taua mai I runga, tu taua mai I raro, tu taua mai I roto, tu taua mai I waho, kia tau ai te mauri tū, kia tau ai te mauri ora, tūtura whakamaua kia tina, tina, haumie, huie, taikie. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ka pai.